My name is Victor F. Abundez-Guerra, and I am here to talk to you folks about responding to morally flawed historical philosophers and philosophies. This paper was originally published by me and Nathan Nobis over at Morehouse College. I am a PhD candidate at UC Riverside right now. This presentation is voiced by me. I am Victor. And if you're interested in this topic, you can find this introductory paper at 1000wordphilosophy.com, along with a bunch of other interesting introductory philosophy papers. So the outline for this presentation is going to be a short introduction, basically who or what is a morally flawed philosopher, and what, if anything, should we do about them? I will be posing that question at the outset. Secondly, I'm going to sort of put some concerns forward, some things we can sort of think about as we look at possible responses that we might have for these morally flawed philosophers. And in particular, I want to highlight 4 potential responses we might have today, or that you might have today. Those responses are acceptance, complete dismissal, historical apologism, or a type of redemption. With that said, let's go ahead and get into the introduction. So this is a quote taken from the original article, and it starts off by saying, look, many historically influential philosophers had profoundly wrong moral views or behaved very badly. If you've been in philosophy for a while now, you might know a few of these. It turns out that there's actually a lot. I'm not going to tell you about all of these. I'm not going to read all of the ones that we mentioned in our paper. But the list is pretty lengthy in Western philosophy. So here we have a few which I'll sort of outline for you or read out to you. So for instance, Hume and Kant were actually huge racists. Nietzsche despised sick people. Mill condoned colonialism. And very on the nose, very obvious, a lot of people know this, Heidegger himself was a Nazi, part of the Nazi party. So what we have in these situations is we have a philosopher, a very famous philosopher with famous intellectual accomplishments and thought, but we also have some serious moral and intellectual flaws in either their beliefs or in their actions. And at least some of their views were false, ultimately unjustified, and perhaps harmful, perhaps very harmful. So given that a lot of times these philosophers are some of our favorites, they turn out to be, in a sense, kind of our problematic favorite or problematic fave. So what should we do about this? Well, before again looking at some potential responses, 4 responses for today, let's look at some concerns. And these concerns, try to keep all of these concerns in mind as we look at some potential responses. So the first concern I want to sort of highlight for us is the idea of people versus propositions. So people are not their propositions, people are not their claims, they're not their beliefs, but what is the relationship between them? Is it a close relationship or is it a very casual relationship? And what, if anything, do those propositions tell us about those people? Maybe nothing at all, or maybe a lot. We also have ad hominem concerns, particularly ad hominem attacks as a concern here. Usually in philosophy, when we do an ad hominem attack towards someone, we usually consider them to be unjustified. But especially if we were thinking earlier, with our earlier concern, that propositions do tell us something about the person, well, can we ever say appropriately condemn a bigot and their bigoted views if that bigotry affects their views and their bigoted views is closely tied to who they are as a person? So that's the second concern. Our third concern is major versus minor ideas. Usually when we have one of these historically flawed philosophers, a common line is to say that, look, their good views are major views, major ideas, and their bad views are just minor ideas. But what justifies this, we might think? Is it the quality of the views? Is it the quantity of the views? And would they themselves also think that their minor views are indeed their minor views and that their major views are indeed their major views? Fourthly, we also have the idea or the concern here of counterfactual correction. If the thinker had better information, better data, better facts, would their philosophy have been better or not? We can speculate about that. And finally, the concern of apology and forgiveness also comes forward, which is that, look, living folks, living philosophers can apologize and change, but with these morally flawed historical thinkers, they're usually dead. they can't really sort of do the same. And if they can't do the same, it will really only be metaphorical or symbolic. And can philosophy as a field, Western philosophy, somehow apologize and be forgiven? So keep all of these concerns in mind, and let's actually look at some potential responses we might have now. So the first response I want to talk to you about is acceptance, which is to take the good and ignore the bad, right? This one, someone who believes this might say something along the lines of, look, Victor, we are all flawed. So why don't we just focus on interesting and good aspects of a flawed thinker? That's what they might say, right? Hypothetically speaking. And there are some pros to this, right? It might be particularly appropriate if their writings have no apparent connection to their bad claims or behavior. Say maybe if they were doing logic, so logic may not directly impact their ethics. But there are cons to this, right? Which is that, look, we might risk misleading or deceiving others into believing the philosopher was not flawed at all. Especially for new students of philosophy, they might incorrectly think that that philosopher was a moral exemplar when they were actually a bit of a scoundrel. Also, our own flaws, if too serious, shouldn't really be overlooked either, even though we might want them to be. So what then is too serious when it comes to our flaws? That's the first response. A second response might swing in the other way, which is, let's just dismiss them. Let's boycott and excommunicate them. Someone who adopts this response says, Victor, if they're so bad, let's just stop reading, researching, and teaching offending philosophers' writings. Let's just get rid of them. Get them out of the canon. A pro of this is that it has a sort of zero tolerance policy feel to it, and sometimes invoked for contemporaries today. You might think of, for instance, cancel culture, especially in light of the Me Too movement, a very recent movement. And when I think, look, if that has merits, then this might as well. Removing that thinker from the canon might show respect to the philosophers, that philosopher's potential victims, right? It might show that we're not going to tolerate any type of discrimination at all, which is a good message to send forward. Again, there are cons to this, which is the first obvious one, is that we're going to have less philosophers in the canon, maybe a lot less philosophers in the Western canon. Also, future philosophers won't benefit from that thinker's insights. And it also might create a sort of sanitized or whitewashed history, a sort of sweeping under the rug, which could be bad. And lastly, for dead philosophers, this punishment, this excommunication, is symbolic at best. Here are more responses. Here's a third response. A third response is historical apologism, which is to judge by past standards. And someone who adopts this response might say something like, maybe they weren't actually blameworthy, Victor, for their views. Given the standards of their times, they simply didn't know any better, and it would actually be unfair to judge them by today's standards. A pro of this is that, hey, look, you're doing a lot of historical contextualization now. Philosophy, after all, does not exist in a vacuum, and this can be useful pedagogically to contextualize them historically in this way. Again, there are cons to every view I'm presenting. And the cons to this response is that it really only works when flawed philosophers really didn't know any better, right? Especially if some of their contemporaries did know better, that also might reflect poorly on them. And if they did know better but still acted poorly, that particularly looks bad on them. But even if they themselves didn't know better or their contemporaries didn't know better, we might think that they still should have known better. Especially since philosophers tend to encourage critical thinking and challenging assumptions. We might think that, hey, they should live up to their own standards. Finally, the fourth response I want to talk about today, which is to use the good to defeat the bad. Someone who adopts this response would say something along the lines of, look, Victor, while the bad should be acknowledged, we shouldn't ignore it, we should acknowledge it, the good is what we should focus on to fix the bad, if that's possible, or to at least diagnose the bad and identify it as the bad. A pro is that, look, we've mentioned before that concealing the bad is misleading and potentially deceptive, so we don't want to do that. This avoids that by acknowledging the bad. But there's cons to this too, right? Because again, we can only really speculate. Had the philosopher realized his good claims were in tension with their bad claims, they might or might not have rejected the bad in favor of the good, or they could have just ignored the tension, or might have rejected actually the good in favor of the bad. We can only really speculate. There are more cons to this, unfortunately. It also assumes that there are always positive elements, that there's always good to sort of purge or redeem the bad. But there's not always going to be the good available to do that. And finally, there's opportunity cost, right? Lesser known philosophers, especially minorities, who have ideas comparable to famous philosophers, may be overlooked in our redemption efforts. I want to close this talk by saying, surely there are other responses. I'm sure you are capable of thinking of other responses. And these responses are not exclusive. It's probably possible that you can use 2 or 3 or maybe even more of these responses at one given time. And they will probably vary depending on the concerns mentioned, as well as many other concerns you might be able to come up with yourself. That's it. I hope you enjoyed this conversation, this talk, as much as I did. And I will see you next time.